The sun had just begun to set over the small colony on the edge of the galaxy. Its warm golden rays painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. For the people living here, life was simple. The colony was built out of sturdy stone houses, clustered together like a family, all standing tall against the vast and empty wilderness. Though it wasn't a bustling city filled with cutting-edge technology, the colony was home to many, including him, a human who had lived there for years, far away from the chaos of the universe. He liked it that way. He preferred the quiet, the slow pace of life, and the certainty that tomorrow would be much like today. But everything changed the day the ship arrived. It was no ordinary ship. The sky had been clear, and the day had seemed just like any other when it appeared, cutting through the atmosphere with a force that rattled the windows of every home in the colony. The ship was massive, dark, and sleek, shaped like nothing anyone had ever seen before. It descended with a grace that seemed impossible for such a giant vessel, landing in the open field just beyond the edge of the colony. It made no sound as it touched down, but the ground trembled, as if announcing its presence with a force that left the people frozen in place. There was always talk of visitors from far-off planets, but nothing like this. This wasn't just a trade ship or a military vessel. It was something else.
Woo!
Something unknown. His heart raced as he stared out of his small window, the sun now hidden behind the ship's shadow. He had always been one to venture into the unknown, but this felt different. The town had never been visited by beings from another world before, let alone something so powerful. Everyone else in the colony was scared. They all stayed inside, peering out from behind their curtains, afraid of what the ship might bring. But not him. Boo. He had never been one to hide. After a moment of hesitation, he grabbed his coat and stepped outside. As he walked through the dusty streets, he noticed the others were still staring, too afraid to leave their homes. Some murmured in disbelief. Others speculated what this could mean. None of them moved, all except him. He wasn't sure what he expected, but when he arrived at the ship, it stood before him like a dark monolith, towering above him. The ship's surface gleamed under the fading light, smooth and unbroken by any windows or doors. But then, without warning, a hatch on the side of the vessel opened with a hiss. The air around him seemed to freeze, and he instinctively stepped back. His breath caught in his throat. A figure emerged from the ship. She was tall, unusually tall, even by alien standards. Her skin shimmered with a deep shade of purple, like the rich color of a twilight sky. Her eyes, sharp and piercing, held a wisdom beyond anything he had ever seen. She moved with a grace that made her seem like she was gliding rather than walking. Every step was measured, purposeful. She was an alien, yet she had the air of someone who had seen and experienced more than any of them ever could. She was the Queen. Her presence sent a shiver down his spine, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. The people around him, still hidden behind their doors and windows, couldn't seem to tear their eyes away from her. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the soft whispers of wind stirring the dust. The Queen stopped a few steps from him, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the colony. She took in the houses, the simple machines, and the quiet life they led. Her expression shifted, momentarily confused. This wasn't what she had expected. She had heard stories of human colonies, but they spoke of grand cities, bustling with technology, not a quiet remote settlement like this one.
And then, her gaze landed on him.
For the briefest of moments, she seemed taken aback, her eyes widening. It was a fleeting expression, one of surprise, maybe even a hint of disbelief, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a look of calm composure. "Are you human?" she asked, her voice smooth, yet carrying an authority that made it impossible to ignore. It was not a question of curiosity, but of certainty, as if she was trying to place him in a way she hadn't been able to with the rest of the colony. He nodded slowly, his mouth dry. Yes, I'm human. She tilted her head slightly, taking in the simple clothing he wore, the dust on his boots, and the calm look in his eyes. There was no fear, no awe in his gaze, just curiosity, as if he were trying to understand what was happening as much as she was. She took a step forward, her expression softening just a little.
I have traveled across many worlds, but I never imagined I would find one so different. This is not what I expected.
She wasn't talking about him, not directly, but about the colony. The simplicity of it seemed to catch her off guard. I suppose it's not much to look at, he said with a small, almost awkward smile. But it's home. The Queen studied him for a moment, and then, almost as if deciding something in her mind, she took another step closer.
I had heard rumors of human colonies, great cities filled with wonders, but this
is something else entirely.
He couldn't help but laugh.
It was the first laugh he'd had all day. Not everyone is interested in wonders, I guess. Some of us prefer things to be a little more grounded. For a moment, he saw a flash of something in her eyes. Amusement, perhaps, but it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by her usual stoic expression. She didn't say anything for a long time. Instead, she looked past him, her gaze sweeping across the colony. There was a tension in the air, and yet there was also something calming about it. The Queen might have been the most powerful being he had ever seen, but in that moment, they were both standing there in silence, both waiting for something. Neither of them knew what came next. Finally, the Queen broke the silence.
You may be right. This world is not what I imagined. But I am still curious about you.
Humans, you are different from what I have known.
Curious? He repeated, surprised. Why? The Queen met his eyes, and for the first time he saw a slight crack in her icy demeanor.
She wasn't just here to conquer or to rule. She was here because something about him, about humanity, had caught her attention. And that, more than anything, intrigued him. I came here expecting something grand, something extraordinary.
But perhaps, she said softly, it's not about what is grand, but about what is real. The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time, he felt a connection with the Queen, one that wasn't based on power or fear or conquest, but on the simple reality of being human. And with that, their journey together would begin. One neither of them had expected. The following days were marked by a sense of uncertainty, not just for the colony, but for the Queen as well. She had arrived with clear intentions, an exploration of Earth's far-flung outposts, perhaps even to secure them for her people. But she had never imagined she would find herself in this position, standing in the midst of something so simple, so ordinary. It felt as if the entire planet had turned upside down. The human had invited her into his home, an offer that still perplexed her. There was no grandeur here, no sophistication. He hadn't taken her to a place of wealth or influence, but to a small, modest structure on the edge of the colony. She had expected a palace of some kind, maybe even something alien in design. What she got instead was a rustic, welcoming cottage. It was so unassuming that at first she thought it was a mistake. Yet, as the days passed, she began to understand that nothing about this place, or this human, was a mistake. At first, she had tried to maintain her distance. She couldn't allow herself to appear vulnerable. But the longer she stayed, the harder it became to resist the pull of curiosity. This human, the one who had so nonchalantly stepped forward to meet her, was different from anything she had encountered before. His life was simple, his existence grounded in the rhythms of everyday survival. There was nothing extraordinary about him, yet everything about him fascinated her. He was unlike the stories she had heard of humans, proud, powerful,
ever expanding into the universe. They had always been depicted as conquerors, driven by ambition, hunger for power, and endless desire for control. But the man she had met was none of those things. He didn't seek to dominate, didn't harbor a thirst for conquest. In fact, he was so different from her expectations that it was almost unnerving. She had spent her entire life surrounded by beings who wore their power like a crown, who carried themselves as if their superiority was the only truth worth living by. Yet here she was, sitting on the floor of this human's home, listening to the hum of the simple machines around her, watching the way he moved through the space with an ease that was foreign to her. There were no whispers of luxury, no signs of opulence. There was only this humble abode, the warmth of a hearth, and a man who seemed perfectly content in his world. The human, whose name she still hadn't learned, had shown her little more than politeness and patience. He had offered her food, shared stories of the colony, and introduced her to the people who lived there. The people of the colony, unlike her expectations, were not afraid of her. They treated her with a kind of distant respect, but also with a surprising amount of familiarity. She could see how they lived, how they had adapted to their world, and how they had learned to survive without relying on the advanced technologies that had shaped her civilization. It was strange. It was as if she had entered a parallel world, one where power and control meant little, and where survival was not about might or force, but about the ability to adapt, to endure. This was not a place that thrived on the grandiosity of its rulers or the dominance of its warriors. It was a world where people had learned to find joy in small things, small victories, small comforts. As the queen stood in the human's small home, she felt something she had never felt before, a sense of vulnerability. She had always been in control, always the one calling the shots. But here, in this strange corner of the universe, she found herself questioning everything. What was she really looking for? What had brought her to this place? What was she supposed to do now? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. The human entered the room, carrying a tray of food. It was a simple meal, bread, cheese, and a small cup of tea. But to her surprise, it smelled comforting, even inviting. She had eaten far more extravagant meals in her lifetime, but none of them had felt as satisfying as this. She glanced at him, her curiosity deepening.
"You don't fear me?" she asked, her voice low and steady. It was a question that had been on her mind since the moment they met.
He set the tray down in front of her, looking her in the eyes. "Why would I fear you?" he replied simply. The question caught her off guard. Of all the things she had expected to hear, that was the last thing she thought he would say. The human was supposed to be afraid of her, to bow before her power, but instead he was calm, confident even. "You are different," she said, more to herself than to him. "I was told that humans would fear me, that they would see me as a threat." He sat down across from her, a small smile tugging at his lips.
"Maybe it's not about fear. Maybe it's about seeing things differently."
"You are not what I expected either." She raised an eyebrow. "Not what you expected?" He nodded, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't this. I thought you'd be like the stories we've heard, ruthless, powerful, unapproachable. But you're not. You're just a person." The queen found herself at a loss for words. This human, this ordinary person, had just described her in a way that no one else ever had. She had been told all her life that her status, her strength, her beauty were the things that defined her. But this human saw her as something more. He didn't see her as a queen, a conqueror, or a ruler. He saw her as someone with hopes, dreams, and maybe even fears. They sat in silence for a while, the air thick with the unspoken understanding that something had shifted between them. The queen didn't know what to make of it. She had come here to assert her power, to demand answers. But instead, she had found herself in a place where power meant nothing. Here, in the simple human world, she was forced to confront something she had never truly considered before, the possibility that there was more to life than domination, more than being the one in control. As the day wore on, the Queen began to realize that she had underestimated humanity. She had come here thinking she knew everything there was to know about them, but the more she spent time with this man, with these people, the more she realized how little she truly understood. Maybe there was more to this than she had imagined. She watched the human as he moved around the room, his actions simple but purposeful. His hands were rough, his clothes worn, but there was a grace in the way he carried himself. He had the calm of someone who knew who they were and what they wanted from life. And that, more than anything, made her curious. She wanted to know more about him, about his world, about what made him tick. And for the first time she realized that perhaps there was something she could learn here, something beyond the endless power struggles she had been raised to understand. The Queen looked at the human again, her mind racing with new possibilities. Maybe this trip wasn't about conquering after all. Maybe it was about discovering what humanity had to offer, a lesson she hadn't been prepared for. The morning light streamed through the small windows of the cottage, casting soft shadows on the floor. The Queen woke early, as she always did. Her mind had been restless throughout the night, filled with thoughts she couldn't quite explain. The quiet hum of the colony, the simplicity of the life she was witnessing, seemed to have crept into her dreams. She had never imagined such peace could exist, and certainly not in a place where she had expected to find only disorder and chaos. Yet here, in this strange corner of the universe, the people went about their day without fear, without the anxiety that often came with the unknown. The human, who had so kindly offered her shelter and shown her his world, was still asleep in the other room. He had insisted she take his bed while he slept on the floor, but she had declined, not wanting to impose. They had spent the previous day together, walking through the town, talking to the people. The more she saw, the more intrigued she became. It was so different from what she had been told. She had expected an entire planet driven by conflict, struggling to survive. But instead, what she found was a world of balance, of coexistence, where survival wasn't determined by dominance, but by understanding and cooperation. The human had shown her many things. He had shared stories of his life and his people. He spoke of the challenges they had faced, disease, war, hardship, but also of the hope that had driven them forward. What amazed her most was the way he spoke of his home. There was no grandeur in his words, no pride in power or conquest. It was the kind of humility she had never encountered before, and it made her think deeply. He had taken her to the fields where the people grew their food. It was a simple sight, rows of crops, tended with care, not driven by the hunger for wealth or territory. The soil here, she was told, was rich and fertile, and the people took pride in their ability to live off the land. There were no machines, no massive harvesters. Everything was done by hand. She had never seen such self-sufficiency before, and it left her with a lingering sense of wonder.
This was a world where the people didn't need to rely on the technology that had shaped her own civilization. They had mastered the art of living with nature, not controlling it.
Her thoughts were interrupted as the human appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. He looked tired, but not unhappy. The simple life suited him, and in his gaze she saw a quiet contentment that she could not ignore. He offered her a warm smile, the kind of smile that reflected both kindness and an open heart.
"Good morning," he said, his voice soft but steady. "I hope you slept well." She nodded, though she had hardly slept at all. The thoughts swirling in her mind kept her awake, thoughts of the place she had arrived in, thoughts of him.
"It is different here," she said, her voice distant, as if still trying to process everything she had seen. "So
peaceful." He smiled again. "Yeah, it's not much, but it's home." The simplicity of his words struck her. He wasn't boasting. He wasn't trying to make her see how impressive their world was. He was just stating a fact, and it made her feel a strange sense of warmth. The Queen had never known peace like this. not in her own realm. Her empire was built on strength, on authority, on the will to dominate. It was a place where power defined everything, where the strong ruled over the weak. But here, in this small corner of the galaxy, there was no need for such things. The people didn't rely on strength to survive. They relied on each other, on their shared commitment to their land and their community. The human invited her to join him for breakfast. It was a simple meal: bread, fruit, and tea. The food was modest, yet it tasted richer than anything she had ever eaten. It wasn't the luxury of the finest delicacies from her homeland, but there was something deeply satisfying about it. She felt the warmth of the tea spread through her, and for the first time in a long while, she felt at ease. There was no pressure, no expectations. She could just be herself. As they sat together, she found herself growing more curious about him, about his life. She had never met anyone quite like him. The people she ruled over, the beings she interacted with, were always calculating, always scheming. But this human was different. He was genuine, kind, and unpretentious. There were no hidden agendas, no need for manipulation. He simply wanted to live, to survive, and to share his world with her. She couldn't understand it, but it intrigued her in ways she couldn't explain.
"What do you want from all of this?" she asked suddenly, her voice breaking the silence between them.
"What is it that drives you?" The human seemed to pause, as if caught off guard by the question. He set down his cup, his eyes thoughtful.
"I suppose I don't know. I want a life that's worth living."
A life where I can wake up every day and feel like I've done something good, something meaningful. The queen looked at him, her heart inexplicably heavy.
"And do you find meaning in this place?
In this life?
He nodded. "Yeah."
I do. It's not perfect, but it's mine.
And it's real. His words hung in the air, and for a moment,
the queen was speechless. She had never heard anyone speak like this, and it unsettled her. In her own world, meaning was something that came from power, from control. It was something that could be achieved through strength and conquest. But this human, this man who lived in a small cottage in the middle of nowhere, found meaning in simplicity, in the quiet moments that most people overlooked. She looked down at her hands, unsure of how to respond. She had spent so many years surrounded by power, surrounded by the demands of her position, that she had forgotten what it was like to seek meaning in something other than victory. The human was showing her something she hadn't realized she had lost: the ability to find joy in the small, ordinary things.
In the way the sun rose over the horizon, in the taste of a simple meal, in the quiet of the night.
"I never expected this," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "I thought I would come here and find a world to conquer.
A world to claim for my people. But instead, I've found something I can't understand." The human smiled again, his eyes kind. "Maybe you're not supposed to understand it. Maybe you're just supposed to experience it."
And just like that, the queen's entire worldview shifted. In the span of just a few days, she had come to realize that there was more to life than conquest, more to existence than power.
There was peace. There was connection. There was something real here, something that couldn't be measured by the amount of strength one possessed.
It was something that couldn't be conquered, something that had to be lived. As the day wore on, the queen found herself contemplating the life she had always known.
She had been taught that her power defined her, that her authority made her who she was. But now, she wasn't so sure. She wasn't sure that power was the only thing that mattered. She wasn't sure that conquest was the key to happiness. For the first time in her life, she wondered if maybe there was a better way, a way to live that didn't require ruling over others, a way to exist without constantly trying to prove her worth. She wasn't sure what the answer was, but as she sat across from the human, watching the light change in his eyes as he spoke of his world, she felt a flicker of hope that there might be more to life than she had ever known. The days that followed blended together in a way the Queen had never experienced. Each morning brought the same simple routine: waking up in the humble cottage, sharing a meal with the human, and spending time walking through the colony, learning more about the quiet life they lived. She had expected to find herself frustrated by the monotony, but instead she found herself drawn into it. There was a sense of calm here, a rhythm to life that she had never known. It was a life shaped by necessity, not by desire for power or wealth, and it was both strange and comforting. The human had taught her many things, not through words, but through actions. He had shown her the importance of community, of how the people here relied on each other for survival. The colony wasn't large, but it was tight-knit. Everyone knew everyone else, and everyone had a role to play. There was no grand hierarchy, no rulers or subjects. Instead, there was a shared understanding that their survival depended on their cooperation. It was a world built on mutual respect, not fear. And for the first time, the Queen wondered what it would be like to live like this, to be a part of something without the burden of leadership, without the constant pressure to maintain control. For so long she had believed that power was everything. But now she wasn't so sure. She had seen firsthand how the people of the colony worked together, not out of obligation, but out of a deep sense of shared purpose. They weren't driven by the need to dominate. They were driven by the need to survive and to live with dignity. One afternoon, as they walked through the fields where the crops were growing, the human turned to her with a thoughtful expression.
"You've been here for a while now," he said.
"Do you think you'll go back to your ship?" The question caught her off guard. She hadn't really thought about returning. She had come here with a mission in mind, a mission that was supposed to be about conquest. But now, with every passing day, the idea of leaving felt less and less appealing. "I'm not sure," she replied honestly. "I never expected to stay this long. I came here with one goal in mind, but this place has made me question a lot of things." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Sometimes it's hard to see things from a different perspective, but that's the beauty of life, isn't it? The ability to change, to grow." She had never thought of life in such terms. Growth had always meant more power, more influence. But here, in this quiet corner of the universe, growth seemed to mean something else entirely. It meant learning to live in harmony, learning to appreciate what you had, and finding meaning in the simple things. It was something that had never been part of her world. The more time she spent here, the more she realized how little she truly understood about life outside of her own experience. She had been raised to believe that strength was the measure of a person's worth. But here, strength didn't come from power or control. It came from the ability to endure, to support one another, and to live with purpose. It was a different kind of strength, one that she had never considered before. As the days passed, the Queen found herself thinking more and more about her own people, about her empire. She had always believed that her rule was necessary, that her power was essential for the survival of her species. But now, she wasn't so sure. She had seen how a small group of people could survive without the need for a ruler. They didn't need a queen or a king to tell them what to do. They worked together, helping one another, creating something that was greater than the sum of its parts. Could her people live this way? Could they find meaning in something beyond conquest, beyond the thirst for power? She didn't know the answer, but for the first time, she began to hope that it was possible. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the land, the human took her to a quiet spot by the edge of the colony. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, and the air was cool and still. The scene was peaceful, almost idyllic, and for a moment the Queen allowed herself to simply be present, to enjoy the beauty of the world around her. She sat down beside him, her mind still racing with thoughts of her people and her future. She had come here expecting to find a world to conquer, but now all she wanted was to understand it. To understand the people who lived here, the simple, humble humans who had shown her a way of life she had never considered before.
"You know,"
the human said, breaking the silence. I think you've changed since you arrived. The queen looked at him, surprised. Changed?
How?
He smiled gently, his eyes reflecting the fading light. You've become more peaceful. You came here with a mission, but now it's like you're starting to see things differently. She thought about his words carefully. She had indeed changed, though she hadn't fully realized it until now. When she first arrived, she had been focused on conquest, on the need to establish her dominance. But now, she found herself thinking about what really mattered. She had come here expecting to find a world to claim, but instead, she had found something far more valuable, a sense of belonging, of community, of real connection. I never thought I would be here this long, she said softly. But I think you're right. Something has changed. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort, of understanding. It's okay to change. It's okay to find a new path. The queen looked at him, the weight of his words settling in her heart. She had always thought that change meant weakness, that admitting to uncertainty was a sign of failure. But now she realized that change was not something to fear. It was something to embrace. She had come here with a single goal in mind, but now she wasn't sure that goal was even important anymore. The world she had discovered, the life she had witnessed, had opened her eyes to new possibilities. For the first time in her life, the queen felt a sense of peace that she had never known. She had spent so long fighting, so long trying to prove her worth, that she had forgotten what it meant to simply live, to exist in harmony with others, to share in the small joys of life, to find meaning in the quiet moments. These were things she had never truly understood before, but now they felt like the most important things in the universe. Come on, he said with a smile.
Let's go back to the cottage. We've got a lot more to talk about.
As they walked back to the small cottage, the queen felt a sense of hope she had never known. The world she had come to conquer had changed her in ways she never expected. And now, as she looked ahead, she wasn't sure what the future held. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. She didn't need to conquer this world. She didn't need to control it. What she needed was to learn from it, to understand it, and to share in its beauty. She had come here to find something to rule, but what she had found was something far more valuable, the possibility of a new way of life. And for the first time, she was ready to embrace it.